We will quickly introduce ourselves before we get started on the content. My name is Sarah Evans, and I represent the Progress Center. I'm a technical assistance provider here at the center. My background and expertise is special education. I spent 25 years in the public school system before I joined AIR a few years ago, and all of my time was in special education. And I'm very excited to bring this session that is highly sought after in many areas of the country right now, as people are really trying to refine and help their educators help themselves really understand how to improve their SDI services for their students with disabilities. I'm going to turn it over to my co-host Kyle, and he's going to take a second to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Excited for everybody to be here. DBI, which we're going to get into, is definitely a topic that I'm very passionate about. So I'm coming from the National Center on Intensive Intervention, or NCII. And NCII's mission is really about promoting how we work with students with intensive needs. And the way that our center approaches that is through this process of data-based individualization. So we're going to unpack that. I'm hopeful if anyone has questions, thoughts, comments, that you'll certainly either put those in the chat or the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll be able to answer anything that you guys have. So excited to be with you all today.
Thanks, Kyle. Kyle and I have had the lucky opportunity to present this session several times at some conferences, as well as doing some of the more in-depth work, which we'll talk about at the end of today. This session is leveraging data-based individualization to design and deliver specialized instruction. And so Kyle and I are partnering together from two different centers. Kyle's representing NCII and I'm representing Progress Center. And together, these two centers have joined to really take some very high quality research process and really think about how this applies to students with disabilities and the work we do through the IEP for specially designed instruction. So this session, as it is only an hour, is a high level overview, but we have lots of resources that we're going to share and some free online modules that we'll share with you that will allow you to dive deeper into this if you would like to in the future. So as we start today, we just kind of want to know who's in the room and what you would do. So since we can see in the chat your name, would you just answer the following questions? What is one thing you're hoping to learn for? And then on a scale of 0 to 4, what is your familiarity or comfort with using data-based individualization to design and deliver specialized instruction? So I'm going to pause and let you guys answer those two questions in the chat, and we'll just kind of see what people have to say. Thanks, Erin, Deborah. Great. So as we see people coming in, we see lots of 2s and 3s. Some people with little knowledge and some people with a high level of knowledge. So we have a vast group of people here today. And everybody's learning is at a different level, but I will tell you that as Kyle and I have had the opportunity to present this session several times, whether you have a high level of understanding or you're very novice to this, everyone has been able to walk away with deepening their knowledge of this content and maybe even finding some additional resources to support your work, which is ultimately our goal. So please keep your answers coming. We love to see them. It really helps us know who's in our audience and how we can support you. But we're going to move into the content for time-wise to make sure we have enough time to get through this. I'm sure you've seen this slide several times in different sessions that you've been in over the last few days. But I want to remind you that Progress Center over the last 6 years has really worked to identify what are the essential elements for the sustainable system. And as you have seen this and you've learned through our beating the odds analysis on the opening session to other sub-sessions that you've been to, that we really have to focus on these 5 main elements. We see our green bar as really the foundational pieces, our green circle that hold those elements together like a puzzle, so that when we have all of this in place, we really see systems that allow students with disabilities to make progress. Today's session is really focused on building one of those elements. It's really focused on individualized instruction and support. Our goal today is to really think about how do we individualize this process, or how do we take a process to really support that individualized instruction that we know students need and we've identified through their IEP. But what is a systematic way in which we can follow to know when we need to change something or adapt what we're doing because we are not seeing growth that we had hoped for? And so this session really focuses on just one of these 5 elements to help elevate that piece. When we look at the IEP development overall and where do we start when we develop SDI, we really want to think about focusing on the class statement. Now, some of you may call this present level statement. Some might call it a PLEP, a PLOP. It is not a universal, PLAP is not the universal term. That is the federal language that we use at the center because that is how IDEA defines the present level statement. And if you use a different one, just think about when I say class statement, that is what I'm intending is your present level, your PLOP, your PLEP, whichever acronym that you use in your local context. But what we know is that SDI starts with the class statement, where we have a class statement that clearly defines what the child's needs are, and we can clearly articulate what instruction needs to occur in order for the child's gap to close and allow them to access and make progress in the general education setting, which is our ultimate goal. Some of you may have been in my session yesterday with Tamara Davis, and you would see that we talked about how do we use this to increase access and progress. This session also talks about it, but is more focused on the SDI piece of it instead of the supplementary evening services. So our session today is really going to take a really deeper look into how do we, after building a present level statement, focus on the statement of services and aids so that we can utilize that and leverage that to be more effective with how our student is making progress with our specialized instruction. So as you can see, when we start here at the class statement, this graphic illustrates the fact that we have an interconnection between all the pieces of the required elements under IDEA. That our class statement itself, as you can see by the top arrow, connects to our statement of services and aids. And yet our statement of services and aids also helps us with our annual goals. Our class statement also supports our annual goals. And our annual goals also help us understand what services, and our annual goals measure whether the services that we're putting in place are allowing the student to make the progress that we anticipated them making as we wrote those annual goals for them. So they're really the measure of whether or not our services are appropriate. And if we have a student out there who is not making progress on their annual goals, then we have to think about how do we shift what we're doing in their services and aids to ensure that they are able to make progress. And our approach to this is data-based individualization. So the center itself was funded on this idea of helping local school districts, state departments, and individuals understand the Supreme Court ruling of Andrew F. The Andrew F. case says we must create an IEP that's reasonably calculated to make progress appropriate in light of the student's circumstances. And when this center was funded, OSEP, the Office of Special Ed Programs, said, we are seeing that our school districts and our educators and our state departments are having a hard time really understanding what does this mean for students with disabilities? What does it mean to have a reasonably calculated IEP? What does reasonable mean? What does appropriate in light of the student's circumstances mean? And so our center went on this mission to say, how do we help do this? And the process of database individualization, which Kyle is going to talk us through those steps here in just a little bit, he's going to really highlight how this systematic process helps us create a reasonably calculated IEP that is appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. It helps define this for us because we are actively collecting and monitoring and refining through a systematic approach. While we're doing that systematic approach, we look at the idea of, are we asking those questions? Through that approach, we think about, what do we want for our students? What's the current reality of the student's circumstances? And that question is often not addressed when we're thinking about developing that class statement. We think that we're putting in the reality, but we sometimes leave out important details that are going to help us understand why the student is or is not making progress the way we intended when we developed the original IEP. Then we ask ourselves, what does the student need to be successful, and how can we maximize the resources and supports the student for the student or the parents and the educators to assist the student. And this process really helps us understand where we can support, how we can ensure success, and what success looks like for that child. Because some children, success is grade level content, and some children success is making a great progress in adapted curriculums. And so we have to recognize that based on the student's individual needs and the impact of their disability. So when we talk about progress, this is a slide you may have seen in other sessions as well. It is a foundational slide here at Progress Center, where we really highlight, what does progress mean for our students with disabilities? And what we have come to understand over the past 6 years, and I think NCII has really embraced this as well, is that how do we help educators, especially our special educators, move past this idea of we just need to ensure that there's progress on the annual IEP goal, to connecting the annual IEP goals to what's happening in the general education setting, and how does that instruction and progress help the student make progress in the general education setting, and ultimately at the perform on the district and state assessments, so that we can see that they're generalizing those skill sets and ultimately generalize those skill sets so they have post-secondary success. And so that's where our two centers have come together to say, how can we support this? Now, NCII also has the luxury of working with students with intensive needs that are not identified under an IDEA, and they utilize the process of DBI as well for students in maybe a tier 3 model if you're using MTSS, or intensive services, or just intensive interventions. And so they broaden theirs out. We help them specify to students with just disabilities. So we're going to spend today here thinking about progress around the IEP goal, but with that thought process of how does that help us get to progress in the general education setting? So when we think about SDI, we want to make sure that we define it for you. And we want to make sure that everybody has the base foundational understanding of what specially designed instruction really is. And it is defined as design and deliver specially designed instruction depends on the evidence-based iterative process that uses individual progress monitoring data to make decisions about adaptations to instruction, instructional delivery, content, and methodology. And you'll hear those 3 words again: delivery, content, and methodology, and how we're going to adapt those using an evidence-based iterative process. So we're excited to be able to share with you how this systematic approach can really help yourself or other educators, or you, if you are supporting educators, really streamline and think about their SDI development and implementation in a more systematic way. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, and he's going to start walking us through the steps to database individualization.
Yeah,
Thanks, Sarah. Much of what Sarah said is a great place to jump into this process of data-based individualization. Sarah mentioned that DBI is a process that can live outside of specially designed instruction. Obviously, what we're going to focus on today in this collaboration between NCII and the Progress Center is really, as Sarah said, how DBI helps us design and deliver specially designed instruction. The first time Sarah and I did this collaboration, the whole purpose was really just making sense of how much specially designed instruction and this process really interconnect. And so our hope is you'll see those interconnections as we work through this DBI process as well. Sarah, you can go ahead and advance the slide.
I just wanted to share with everybody
Yeah.
that I shared the placemat, so you can reference back to the placemat for them.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. The placemat is really just kind of this visual that you see on the right side of this slide. I always tell people I am a visual learner, and so all of the resources on our NCII website that really break down this DBI process are available, readily available to you, and so we hope that you'll take advantage. I know a lot of you guys in the chat said you're looking for resources for teachers, and so hopefully you guys can take those and maximize those. We're going to really break down each step of this DBI process. And I know we've already talked about this a little bit, but I want to just make it really clear on this slide that DBI is a process. I should have mentioned earlier, my background is school psychology. And so I did a lot of work in the RTI, MTSS space, as well as, working with teachers who work with students who are on IEPs. And I got to tell you, this process of, I see you, Rebecca. The process of this DBI process is really ideal when we think about how do we meet the needs of those students who have the most challenges, right? And so usually when I'm with a group of people, I ask, who in the audience is either, currently or has worked with students that have intensive needs, or perhaps who supports teachers who support students with intensive needs. And usually every hand comes up, right? Like we've all worked with that one student who, frankly, we go through all our tricks as we know as educators, and we just can't find the magic wand, right? Like we just can't find what it is that works for this student. And I always start talking about DBI in that way because I want to encourage you. We may not ever find that magic wand, but I promise you, DBI is the process that moves us closer to that. And I hope that as we work through this process, you'll see that, and you'll kind of see how it helps educators sort of get control of how we educate our students. So, Sarah, you can go ahead, go to the next slide because we're going to break down each of these steps as we talk through them. So when we think about these 5 steps of DBI, and again, we've got a slide for each one of these, so I won't go into too much detail, but kind of as an overview, it really always starts with what we're currently doing, right? So again, if you live in that MTSS, RTI space, that could be a tier 2 intervention, right? That validated intervention program. But I really want us to think when we're looking at DBI through this SDI lens, we're really just talking about the current IEP, right? Like what we've all agreed upon as an IEP team that we're delivering, right? Whether it's the content methodology or the actual delivery of the IEP, okay? But DBI always starts with that first step of what we're already doing, okay? The next step of DBI is progress monitoring. I always say progress monitoring is what moves us through this process. And so you'll see as we unpack, students are either going to be making progress. And so in that case, we'd say they're responsive to the specially designed instruction. Or as we know, most of those kids, or I should say a lot of those kids that have those intensive needs, oftentimes are non-responsive. And so that's going to move us into the third step of DBI, which is the diagnostic data step. As a school psychologist, this is obviously a step that I love because it just means really what we need to do is collect more information, right? Like if we have a student who's non-responsive to what we're doing, then we need to collect more information. I want to be very clear. This is informal data. This could be in format of observation. Perhaps if you use a tool, an assessment tool that has a diagnostic piece to it, it could be something like that. But really think informal diagnostic data. The next step, which is really linked to the diagnostic data piece, is the intervention adaptation, right? So when we talk about trying to find what works for this student, that's where we're leveraging that information from the diagnostic information that we've collected and really linking that to how we're making an adaptation, how we're changing the intervention or how we're changing the IEP. And then the last step of DBI is just that continued progress monitoring, how we're really going back to data collection and committing to letting that data drive our instructional process. And again, our hope is always that a student's going to be responsive, perhaps to that singular adaptation that we've made, but we might find that we need to continue to make adaptations. And if that's the case, then we'll just continue to work through this DBI process. So Sarah, go ahead and advance. Yeah, so we're going to break down each of these steps now kind of in more detail. I tend to get ahead of myself, so I often talk about these things in too much detail prior to getting to them. But I know, again, specifically for this SDI process, when we talk about laying that foundation for DBI, we're really, again, talking about that standardized instructional program that we know has evidence that supports it. And so I know Sarah has some additional resources through the Progress Center. I'll go ahead and put those in the chat, but I know Sarah wants to share those with you guys now.
So as we move through this process, and like Kyle shared, is that the first step is really starting at where we're at. And so we want to make sure that everybody here today really has that clear understanding of what is SDI, where does it fit within our required requirements under IDEA, and how does that impact what we're doing within this process. So we're going to start off with just and Kyle's going to share this tip sheet. You can pull it up on your own. But this is called the Statement of Services, the overview of the Statement of Services and Aids. And this tip sheet really highlights what IDEA says is our requirement for services and aids within the IEP process. And so if you look at this statement after the 4 there, you'll see that this includes 4 parts. We have special education, related services, supplementary aids and services. Many of you know that as accommodations and modifications, and then program modifications and support for school personnel. So this element of the required parts of an IEP is really 4 different areas in which we can provide services and aids to students. When we look a little bit deeper, we go to the next tip sheet that breaks this down. Now, the Progress Center website has all the tip sheets for every part. Today, we're only going to cover the one focused on what is special education with a focus on SDI, because that's the content of our presentation today. But I do want you to be aware that if you have interest, there are the other tip sheets for the other 3 parts that we're not going to go in depth into today. But as we look at this second tip sheet under what is special ed and a focus on SDI, and Kyle will put that in the chat as well, we notice that it states that special education includes all of the following. It includes specialized instruction, examples of like speech therapy or other related services that are actually considered special ed and not related services, travel training, and vocational training. So that's what special education is. And then we break it down a little bit further and say, well, what is SDI then? SDI is the third part of the 3rd section of special education. And it says that we have to adapt the instruction for students under content, methodology, and delivery of instruction. That adaptation needs to address the unique needs of the child based on how the impact of their disability affects their learning. And so it's not on the disability category, it's on how that disability is impacting that individual students or the unique learning trajectory. The idea of SDI also ensures access to the general education curriculum so that the child can meet the educational standards that all students are required to meet. So SDI does, by law, say we have to look at more than the IEP goal. We have to look at ensuring that when we're providing this instruction, it is allowing the child to make that progress on those educational standards that all students are getting access to and progress. And so we lay that foundation and say, well, let's break this down a tad further. What does it mean to adapt content, methodology, and delivery of instruction? So when we break that down, we think about content is what is taught to the student so that they can access that general education programming. Methodology is how we instruct, or the delivery or practices or approaches that we use to deliver the content. And then we have delivery of instruction, which is who, where, and when. And what we have found as we've done work nationally, that there is an over focus on the delivery of instruction and less of a focus on how do we adapt content and methodology. So when we say, well, what does that mean? I'm not really sure when you say content. We break it down and say, what does it mean to teach an adaptation to content? And that is where we adapt the social behaviors or teach to the social behaviors. We talk about what are the big 5 parts of reading so that they, what areas in those big parts are they missing? Cognitive, metacognitive strategies, functional skills, handwriting, spelling, all of those things are what we teach. It's the content. It's a gap in the content that the student is missing, which is why they're not able to make progress in the general education setting, and they need this specialized instruction. Then when we look at methodology, that is how the instruction is delivered. And so that might be a systematic approach, such as explicit instruction, one-on-one, small group. It might be fluency times. It might be using concrete, semi-concrete representation, scaffolding, all different types of methodology that could be used in order to teach content. And then we finally look at the adaptation under delivery, and we think about where is it in a special ed classroom, general education classroom, community-based classroom? Who is going to deliver it? Because if you read the tip sheet that Kyle shared around SDI, you will see that by law, it does not say the special education teacher has to be the one delivering the SDI. It says who on the IEP team, the IEP team determines who is the best person to deliver the SDI. And sometimes we have people trained in our schools on specific methodologies that are better suited to meet that student's individualized needs because of their background and training. And so they become the one that delivers SDI. Yes, our special educators support them. Yes, that's a partnership and a collaboration, and they're not just given that responsibility. It is a team approach. And we really want to drive that home, that this whole process is a team approach. So the last slide I'll share before I hand it back to Kyle to finish all the steps is that as we think about adapting content, methodology, and delivery of instruction, we have to think about the importance of fidelity to the SDI. As we are thinking about, we're still at step 1, where we were just saying, this is what we've been doing. This is what the IEP originally designed, and we're just evaluating. Did we even give them what we said we gave them? And that's what fidelity really is looking at. It's the effectiveness of our SDI that we're currently giving them. Did we give them everything that the amount of time that we said? Did they get the amount of quality that we said that they were going to get? Did we adhere to the programming that we set out for? That is a critical piece before we change. What we often find is that maybe we didn't deliver the SDI with fidelity, and the reason the child is not making progress has nothing to do with how we're teaching or what we're teaching. It really means they never got what we said they were supposed to get. And so we want to make sure that we really adhere to our SDI, and we really ensure we deliver it with fidelity. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kyle for the rest of the steps so he can really bridge Now that we know where we're at, how do we move forward when we know a student isn't responding?
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. And that's, what Sarah just said is a great lead in to jumping to the next step of progress monitoring, right? Because really when we look at the data that we collect through assessments to determine whether or not a student is responding to the specially designed instruction, we really need to first look at the fidelity of the delivery of that specially designed instruction. I know as a school psychologist, when I worked with educators and we would see data that suggested a student was not responding, we would begin having a conversation about what had been done. And oftentimes, for various reasons, right? It might even be a reason that's on the student, right? Perhaps they didn't attend because they were sick, or they're having transportation issues, whatever it might be. And so the fidelity of the SDI was in question from the beginning. And in that case, we may not want to change anything, right? So always start with fidelity. I don't think we can emphasize that enough. Okay. Hey, Sarah, somebody asked if they could get the link to the 5 fidelity elements. I'm sure you're on that. Okay, so really now jumping, let's say we have fidelity with the SDI that we've delivered. And again, as Sarah said, we're looking at a student that perhaps is responding or not responding. And I hope as educators or people who work in this education space, we're all looking at data to make that determination. So Sarah, as I tasked you to do one thing, I'm going to task you to also advance the slide, please. Thank you. And so here we are, right? And I think for us to really make good decisions about the progress of our students, as you all know, we should really be basing that in data, right? And so, of course, we don't have a time to look at this graph like I'd like to. This is the kind of things that I really like to dig into. And so if you want to continue to, engage with us after this session, please go to our sites, look at our websites, look at all the information we put out. But essentially what we're looking at here is, perhaps we're in a data meeting in a school and we're looking at, you've got that phase line, which is that initiation of the current IEP, which again is that first step of DBI, right? And now we're just looking at these data points, trying to make a determination as to whether these data indicate that the SDI that we're currently providing is working. There's other things on this graph, like I said, that really allow us to make that determination. There's an aim line here that's really just connecting where our students started their raw score with whatever we're measuring to their goal score, where we want them to be. And then there's data points, right? And so because we've graphed this, we can do visual analysis really quickly to make a determination. And so you guys can put in the chat if you'd like. For time, we're going to get through this kind of quickly. But I'm curious, would you guys say that the data here indicate that the SDI is working for this student? So feel free to put yes or no. If you're like me, you could say it depends. That's my answer to everything. Sarah loves that. Um, so I'll give you guys a second to think through that. Don't be afraid to respond. So again, the question is, do data indicate that the SDI is working? Okay, I see one response, two, three, perfect. Okay, all right, you guys are great. You guys are doing great. And the answer here is yes, right? So if we look at the current data of whether or not our students are making progress, we see that they are, right? Now, if you'll advance the slide, Sarah, we also know that that's not always the case, right? And especially when we're working with students who perhaps are on IEPs, but also as we talk through our National Center on Intensive Intervention, those students that have the most intensive needs, right? And so here you can see the data, and the trend of that data is clearly below that goal line where we would like for them to be. So Sarah, go ahead. So let's just pretend as we work through these steps, we provided that first validated intervention program. And so we've now moved to the second step. We've collected that assessment data, that progress monitoring data that tells us whether or not they're responding or not responding. And really, that just tells us when, right? That progress monitoring data tells us when they're not responding. But for us to effectively adapt our intervention or to adjust that content, that methodology, that delivery, we've really got to answer that question of why the student is not responding. And the way that we do that is through collecting that diagnostic data. Okay. So Sarah, go ahead. Okay, and so we do have resources through the National Center on Intensive Intervention that help us get to that, right? That help us answer that question of why is my student not responding, right? I know that they're not because of the progress monitoring data that I've collected, but what I need to figure out now is why they're not responding. And so some of these resources that you can see on the screen, and I know Sarah just put some of those in the chat, they're really, for example, this one on the screen is about clarifying questions to help us create that hypothesis so we can make a determination of how we'd like to change our instructional practices, how we can change our SDI. So again, as Sarah's alluded to, we might determine that we need to make a change to our content and methodology. We might determine that we need to change the delivery of our instruction. And so again, these resources are designed to help you do that. All right, go ahead, Sarah. Okay, and so here is just an example of how we can use diagnostic data to help us develop a hypothesis and therefore guide the way that we would adapt our instructional practices. So how we would adapt either our content or our methodology or our delivery. Okay, so I know you all can read this, but just for us to stay together, I'm going to read this really quickly. Again, to kind of keep us all on the same page. This is a student who were working through the DBI process. So they had that initial IEP. We collected progress monitoring data. It said that they were not responding. And so we're at step 3 here, collecting informal diagnostic data. And this is what we've collected. The teacher reviews classroom assessment data and conducts observations of the student's learning behavior. The behavior observations suggest that the student struggles to master skills as quickly as their same age peers and needs more practice opportunities than their peers. So again, when I introduced this diagnostic step, I said we're really talking about just informal data here. Anything that can help us make a determination about why. That's the big question here, is why they're not responding. So anytime we collect some diagnostic data, Sarah, were you going to jump in or was that somebody else?
Somebody else.
Okay. So, anytime we collect this informal diagnostic data, we really want to link that to a hypothesis. Okay. So we have some diagnostic data at the top, and then our hypothesis here based on that diagnostic information is this. If the student is provided additional opportunities of direct instruction, feedback, and practice on target skills, then the student would move to mastery of these skills more quickly. Again, that hypothesis is directly linked to that observation of the student in their learning environment. I can't remember, Sarah, if this is where we're asking them to make a
Next,
determination
after
about
the
what.
next step.
Okay,
After the
okay,
next.
okay. So go ahead and advance us then. All right, and so as I've kind of alluded to, and what we're going to ask you all to do in just a moment is when we create that, when we look at that diagnostic data and we collect that information, again, we want to then use that information to guide us to a hypothesis, right? What we think might make a difference in their instructional practices to help them respond, to help them make some gains, right? And so we use that hypothesis for the 4th step, which is how we would then intensify and individualize the intervention. Okay. So go ahead, Sarah. So again, looking back at that diagnostic data that I just read to you guys, we just walked through, we then use that information to create this hypothesis, right? Which again is if the student is provided additional opportunities of direct instruction, feedback, and practice on target skills, then the student would move to mastery of these skills more quickly. So that's our hypothesis. So our question to the group, and we'd love if you guys would go ahead and put something in the chat here, is when we look at our adaptation, step 4, that instructional adaptation, what element based on the diagnostic information and the hypothesis that we created, which of these elements of instructional need, which of these elements of instruction need to be adapted? So your answer would either be the content, which is the what, the methodology, which would be the how, or the delivery of instruction, which is more of the who, where, and when. Okay, so I'll give you guys about 30 seconds to think through that. Again, we're looking for what element of the instruction would need to be adapted based on that diagnostic data and that hypothesis that we created. Okay,
Got
I
a
see a
couple
few
coming
answers.
up.
Yeah, okay. We'll give you guys a couple more seconds. Sarah, you can advance it whenever you want. Okay. So I think methodology is the response that I saw most often in the chat. So that's great, right? And so when we think about the behavior observations suggesting that the student struggles to master those skills as quickly as their same age peers, that's where we created that hypothesis where we said if the student is provided additional opportunities of direct instruction and feedback, we would get to the, perhaps, right, making additional growth that we had not seen before. Sarah, is there anything you want to add to this?
No, I think it's just a reminder that if you said something other than methodology, it really often has to do with how clear we've written the hypothesis. And of course, these are imaginary students that we're making up scenarios on. And so sometimes it's harder for us to be as clear as you might be when you actually have the data and the context of the student. So keep that in mind if you
Yeah.
chose one that wasn't methodology.
Yeah, it's always fun when Sarah and I present this in person. We always get people that push back a little bit against us, which we love, right? Because as Sarah alluded to, I don't know that there's always one answer. I told you my favorite answer is it depends. I didn't see any of those in the chat, which is totally fine. But I think, right, like it's always about collecting additional data or as much data as we can and making our best guess, which is why we call it a hypothesis. But obviously, we want to get to the point where we can make the best adaptation that we believe might be the most meaningful for that student and their academic growth. Okay. So here's another additional example. We'll go through this quickly so we can get to the last part of our presentation. I agree in that. It depends is code for I need more information, which is always my answer. So, okay, so diagnostic data in this case, so different student here, indicate that the student has difficulty applying decoding strategies to words with short and long vowels, especially I and E. Okay, and so again, this is just informal. We go in, we observe the student in their learning environment because we know they're not responding to the current SDI, and we're trying to answer that question of why, right? When we think about all of this within that DBI process. So when we collect this information, we want to use this to drive how we're going to continue to adjust our instruction. So we want to create this hypothesis. So in this case, if the student is provided additional instructional time in decoding short and long vowels, then the student will improve their decoding and oral reading fluency. So our question to you, again, just like last time, is what element or elements of instruction needs to be adapted based on this hypothesis, right? So step 4 is really linking that hypothesis to how we want to adapt our instruction. So I'll give you guys about 30 seconds again. So again, our answer would either be content, methodology, or delivery.
We have some silvery coming in,
Yeah.
and the answer is delivery.
Yeah. See some delivery win. Yeah, so nice work, everyone. And I'm glad that you guys are tracking with us. Sometimes I feel like we get so into the weeds of this that it gets confusing. So it's always encouraging when we see answers coming across. So yeah, so right, like when we think through how we want to adapt our SDI specifically for this student, we really want to look at that delivery of instruction. Again, this is based on information that we've collected. So Sarah, go ahead. Um, do we want to skip this one and make sure we got enough time to get to the last part?
Yeah, we have time to do one more.
Okay, so one more here. Fidelity and observation data indicate that the student is becoming more frustrated and less engaged in the intervention. So we use that information to develop this hypothesis. If the student was more engaged and able to control their frustration, then the student would benefit more from the academic instruction. So when we think about adapting our SDI, are we going to adapt the content, the methodology, or the delivery? Give you guys about 30 seconds.
We were kind of split half and half, content and
Yeah,
methodology. All right. We have it marked as content.
yeah. So again, I've heard people make cases for why this would be methodology. Um, and again, you can split hairs and, really kind of figure out what the right answer is here. But for this specific one, we did content mostly because of that what piece, right? Um,
And I'll
anything
say,
you want to add,
Kyle,
Sarah?
I was going to add that, this is just fun and engagement for you guys to kind of really think about what we're talking about when we get through these steps. But as we talk about at the end of the session today, we'll talk about how we present this content in a larger scope and not just this high level. And when we're in this process of helping people develop their own hypothesis, this really helps us illustrate the critical piece of how the hypothesis is written, because the hypothesis is going to tell you what to adapt. And so we go through a whole bunch of exercises in that process to make sure they're clear. And you can see when this one is not as clear, you could debate whether it's methodology or content, and it could go either way depending on how you're looking at that. And so I just highlight that when we get more in-depth instruction happening, we really work on that piece of making sure the hypothesis helps us know how to adapt.
Yep. And then I just, one more step here, which we've talked about already, is this idea of really committing to collecting data to determine the responsiveness, right? And in this case, it would be the responsiveness to the IEP with the adaptations that have been put in place. And I want to share with you guys, and so as whether you work with students or you support teachers that work with students, oftentimes I feel like when we get to this step of DBI, it can kind of feel overwhelming. But I want to shift your thinking a little bit. I want to encourage you just to think, these students that come to us, every day or at least Monday through Friday, where we do feel like we don't have the answer. We don't have that magic wand. I really want to encourage you that DBI, as I started with, is that process that I hope you see now helps us problem solve and work towards hopefully finding what that right answer might be, right? I can't guarantee that we'll ever find the right answer for every kid, but I hope you see that working through this DBI process really helps us design and deliver the SDI that we provide to students every day. So, Sarah, you can go to this next slide. This is just again where, now we're just looking at this continued progress monitoring data. So again, we have another phase line here. This is just that initial SDI plus the adaptation, right? And so I think what you'll see here is that the student now is trending towards their goal, but you could make a case if you wanted to commit and not say it depends. You could make a case here where you might say that they might need additional adaptations. There might be something else that we could layer on top of that first adaptation that might increase their learning. So in that case, we would just know that we would go back to that DBI process. And so, Sarah, you can advance it one more time. And just know, right, that sometimes DBI really is that ongoing process. This, again, is where I think sometimes it can feel overwhelming. But again, these kids are coming to us every day. And I always leave feeling like DBI at least is a solution to how we get to finding the answer for those students with the most intensive needs. So.
And I would concur, Kyle. And I think that what we have seen as we've done this work across some states and local districts is that it builds confidence and competence of our teachers to know that sometimes they feel like when they have a graph that shows a student not making progress and they're working really hard with that student and they can't figure out what's happening and they're using all the tools in their tool bag and it's not helping, they get defeated because they feel like they internalize it as an individual teacher. And they say, oh, I'm not good at my job. I can't do this. And what we help people understand is that it isn't necessarily that they're using poor instruction or that they're not doing what they need to for that student. It's that we have to figure out what we're missing in that recipe for that student to be able to learn well. And this process gives them a systematic approach that gives them structure so that they're not just grasping at anything, that they really have a systematic process and a team that really helps figure out what is the next step, what is the next adaptation we'll try over time. And I see we have a question. It says, do you recommend that the data points are always measured by weekly time increments, or are there other discrete measurements? So when we go into our in-depth series, we talk about this. Kyle, I love how you put it depends.
Yeah, and I was going to expound, but go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You expand.
Yeah, no, and I'm sorry if I interrupted you, Sarah, and
Oh,
I appreciate. I mean, I'm sort of joking, but I'm sort of not in the sense of, I think it would depend on, the whatever skill you're measuring. Sometimes there's certain skills that are very sensitive to growth, like oral reading fluency or some of our, phonics measures. And then there's some measures that we utilize that are not sensitive to growth at all, like comprehension types of measures. And so in that case, I think a lot of that really depends on what you're actually measuring. We also talk at NCII a lot about feasibility. And so what I mean by that is, you know, there's some new research that's coming out that says there's not a lot of difference in doing weekly progress monitoring versus biweekly versus monthly. And so a lot of it depends on what your educators can actually, facilitate throughout a day and a week and a month. Ideally, we settle on, at the center that when we're talking about students that have intensive needs, about doing weekly progress monitoring. And the reason for that is because you're going to have a lot of data to really make determinations quickly, right? Um, and so I think a lot of it is really, truthfully, it depends. If there's a specific instance or case that you'd like to discuss, Michael, I'm happy to discuss, deeper, maybe on a different call.
and I shared a tool that we have from NCII that is decision rules that help us look at that. And I think, Kyle, what you were saying about the fact that the frequency of collecting the data is about how fast we can adapt. So the more intensive the kiddo is, we don't often want to wait 6 months to take 6 data points monthly because we want to be able to adapt that instruction quicker if they're not making progress. So it's really about how much data do we need to be able to make a decision. And so this might help you with some decision rules around what do we need to make those decisions.
Yeah,
It's a tool that they have.
yeah. And the last thing I'll say, and I apologize, this is getting to the last part of your question, Michael. There are so we're talking about formal progress monitoring, when we talk about working through the steps of DBI. But you mentioned in the last part of your question, are there other discrete measures? And I think I know what you're saying there. And that could be some more informal progress monitoring, right? Like I think sometimes, when we just listen to students read, or we give them opportunities to respond throughout the week in our class, there's definitely informal data that we collect that can help us determine whether or not they're making progress or not. And I think there's a place for those, and I think they should be utilized. I just want to be clear when we're talking about formal progress monitoring, we're really talking about those assessments, where we sit down and work with a student individually. So,
Thank you. Good questions. Keep
yeah,
them
for sure.
coming if you have more. We're going to move into the last section of this where we've kind of wrapped up what are the steps, how does it connect to SDI, how do we move through them? Of course, there's a lot of information that we can't share within an hour. But one of the things that we wanted to share is how are we seeing local districts and states build capacity to use DBI for SDI? Because we get a lot of requests at Progress Center around how do we do this well, and we need help. And oftentimes people will say, come in and do a progress monitoring training or come in and talk about SDI. And what we're finding is that we need to connect the bigger picture for people. That doing one of those types of trainings in isolation is making it harder for people to really know, how do I utilize progress monitoring? And then how do I apply that to SDI? And so this last section is really just meant to say, what have we done? These are some examples of ways other places have done that. So if you're in charge or you have interest in exploring this further, it can give you some ways to start navigating down that path of building capacity. So what we see for current practices is we typically do a 5-part series covering each one of the steps in depth. And we have done them both virtually and in person, so it can go either way. And this is not meant to be like a sales pitch. This is meant to really help you understand, like, you can do this yourself. We have a whole series of free online modules between Progress Center and NCII that you can couple together and have people engage with and walk through this process step by step as well. And so we do find that when it's activity-based and that the educators are given some content, asked to apply that content and knowledge to some work with students, coming back and reviewing that and applying it to the next step of the process, we see exponential growth with those participants. Here's some example of our objectives, or some of the objectives that we have used within our series, so you can see how we break it apart. So if you're thinking like, man, this would be great for my district, or I personally would love to find those free modules or other resources to build my capacity, this might help you kind of know what to focus on. We lay out our sessions, as you can see, really on each one of the steps of the process so that people can actively do that. One thing I want to point out, and the reason we put this slide in here, is that this is really meant to be a teaming process. One aha that we have had as we've done training and working with people is that when we focused on training and the teaming process first, people really struggle because if a school district or the local context doesn't have a good teaming process already in place, they get very focused on that and they don't necessarily get into the other steps of the process of DBI. And so when we have flipped it and we say, let's go through the steps, because as an individual, you can do this. You don't have to have a team. It's ideal in a team. It works better in a team, but an individual teacher can do DBI with their students and have great success. When we put the teaming process at the end, they have this knowledge and confidence after those sessions that then allows them to say, I could put this with this team. I could utilize it. I could put it in my IEP process. These are just some resources or some quotes that we have from educators from some of the work that we've done, and you can see some of the things that they say about how it's really changed that. You know, my progress monitoring is more effective. It built my confidence. It's doable and it aligns with my current work. And so it's something that they're looking for. This is some work that Kyle and I did in Alabama that we just wanted to show, like, this is engaging people in this series of work, and this concept of DBI for SDI is really been helpful for them to feel like I can follow the process and I understand now how to implement my SDI at a greater level. And I know how to make adaptations. I see how it fits in my MTSS processes. And so we just share that for you because I think it's important to know that. Wyoming actually had the opportunity to do this as a statewide initiative, and they did this with many schools. And this is some of their outcome data that as they engaged in a DBI process series for their SDI, you can see that schools that were in the DBI process really outperformed on their statewide assessments for students with disabilities in 3rd grade. And it really shows the progress that people make with this. So I just can consider something to consider for you as we get towards the end of the session. If you want more information, Kyle's going to put in the chat the link to these videos. This just helps you hear real educators talking about what it was like to go through this process.